Teddy Roosevelt, the president that kept reading a speech after being shot, 1912. The famous American Theodore Teddy Roosevelt was the biggest hero of the Spanish-American War of 1898, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for mediating an end to the Russo-Japanese, and was the inspiration for the teddy bear toy. One time he found himself in a bar fight when a cowboy was shooting wildly at the room, scaring the customers. The cowboy called Roosevelt Four Eyes in reference to his famous spectacles, and followed Teddy around with his guns. Roosevelt hit him in the jaw with his left and right fists. Then the cowboy's guns went off and he hit his head on the bar, knocking him unconscious. Another time, Roosevelt's boat was stolen. Him and his friends built a boat from scratch in 3 days to hunt down the thieves. They tracked them down along the river while in temperatures as low as 0 degrees Fahrenheit. When they caught the thieves, Roosevelt roughed up and captured the men and brought them back to be arrested. It's said that to pass the time on the journey back, he read poetry to the dangerous bandits. Roosevelt was elected Vice President of the United States in 1901, but just over 6 months later he became the 26th president, when the current president, William McKinley, was assassinated after being shot twice by Polish-American anarchist Leon Solga. At 42, Roosevelt became the youngest president in the nation's history, when the U.S. president refused to shoot a bear cub on a 1900 hunting trip. A toy maker named a stuffed bear after Roosevelt. Soon the teddy bear fad swept the American nation. Roosevelt was also a mixed martial artist in jiu-jitsu, judo, and boxing. He loved boxing, and he continued to do it even when he reached the White House. He would often challenge professional boxers to hit him in the jaw as hard as possible, and wouldn't hesitate to then knock them back. One day, Roosevelt challenged Colonel Dan T. Meade, a military aide at the White House, to a boxing match in the White House gym. Roosevelt demanded a tough fight. In the fight, Meade's punch landed on Roosevelt's left eye, damaging blood vessels and making him blind in that eye. After this, he continued fighting in jiu-jitsu and judo. Roosevelt was successfully re-elected for a second term as president in 1904 and served until 1109. He then decided not to try to be re-elected for another time, as he felt it was time for a younger man to take over. But by the time of the next presidential elections in 1912, he had become disillusioned about how his party, the Republicans, were running the country. So he stood as the presidential candidate for a newly formed Progressive Party, which was often referred to as the Bull Moose Party. It got its nickname because Roosevelt was often described himself as having the strength and vigor of a bull moose. His running for a third term as a president was considered controversial because he intended to break the American tradition of two-term presidency. And while campaigning in Milwaukee and the state of Wisconsin in hope of being elected president once more, Roosevelt nearly suffered the same fate as McKinley. He was about to give a speech when John Fleming Schrank, a Bavarian-born saloon keeper, attempted to kill Roosevelt by shooting him with a revolver. The bullet struck Roosevelt in his chest, but his life was saved as the bullet was slowed down considerably as it went in first through the heavy overcoat he was wearing. Then, the steel-reinforced eyeglass case in his breast pocket. And finally, the steel-reinforced eyeglass case in his breast pocket. 50-page copy of the speech he was about to give, before finally becoming lodged in his chest. The crowd screamed in panic, but Albert Martin, secretary of the president and an ex-football player, leapt from his car and tackled Schrank to the ground. Soon former Rough Riders, bodyguards, and policemen were upon the assassin and began hitting him. Roosevelt stumbled, but then straightened himself and reassured the audience with a beaming smile. He turned to his aide, saying, "He pinked me, Harry." The crowd demanded blood and for Schrank to be killed. It was only Roosevelt who seemed to be calm and wanted to prevent this, shouting, "Don't hurt him! Bring him here! I want to see him!" Roosevelt then asked the shooter, "What did you do it for?" When there was no answer, he said, "Oh, what's the use? Turn him over to the police." Feeling the bullet hole in his chest, Roosevelt coughed 3 times. As an experienced hunter and anatomist, he concluded that the lack of blood being coughed up meant that the bullet had not reached his lung. Roosevelt, feeling he was not seriously injured, insisted to the doctor that he was going to give his speech. The speech lasted for 84 minutes, despite the blood that could be clearly seen staining his shirt. He started the speech by saying, "I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Then, when his speech was finally over, he allowed himself to be taken to the hospital, where the doctors decided it would be more dangerous to remove the bullet, and instead left it lodged in his chest muscle, where it remained for the rest of his life. Schrank, the would-be assassin, was later to claim he was told to kill Roosevelt by the ghost of the former President McKinley, who came to him in a dream. Roosevelt recovered quickly, but was not successful in his bid to be re-elected as president, and later devoted much time to being an explorer as well as a successful author. He died in his sleep from a blood clot on January 6, 1919, at the age of 60. As for Schrank, at his trial he was deemed insane and spent the rest of his life in a mental institution. He died of bronchitis in 1943 at the age of 67. George H.W. Bush, the president who avoided being eaten by cannibals in World War II. George Herbert Walker Bush was the last U.S. president that served in combat. There were a number of his predecessors who also paid their debt to the country, but George Bush's experience was completely unique. He managed to evade the gruesome death of being eaten by Japanese soldiers. When the Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, George Bush was only a 17-year-old teenager. He was attending the last year of the Phillips Academy University Preparatory School in Andover, Massachusetts. In the days after the attack, the people of the United States experienced a rush of patriotism. It was the same case with young Bush, who wanted to enlist as soon as possible so he could serve his country. Since he was still underage, his first idea was to enlist in Canada. But he changed his mind due to his strong wish to serve as an aviator in the U.S. Navy. As soon as he graduated and turned 18 on June 13, 1942, George Bush signed up for the U.S. Naval Reserves. 1 year after he joined the Navy, he was commissioned as an ensign. Many believed at the time that he was the youngest pilot in the U.S. Navy, as he was only 19 years old. It didn't take long when in the spring of 1944, he was sent as a pilot to the USS San Jacinto light aircraft carrier. He arrived just in time to participate in the campaign of island hopping against Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Still a youngster, George Bush became an experienced pilot after fighting over Marcus and Wake Island. He also participated in one of the largest air combats in the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. And in the final day of the battle, after returning from the mission, Bush had to make a forced landing on the water. It was his first crash in the war. Luckily, he and his crew were rescued by the destroyer USS Clarence K. Bronson. The second one, however, was far more dramatic. As American forces were rolling northwards on the Pacific, they commenced a campaign on the Bonin Islands in August 1944. It was the same month when George H.W. Bush was promoted to lieutenant junior. On September 2nd, Bush received an order to fly in a group with 3 other bombers towards the island of Chichijima. Their mission was to destroy a very important radio tower that was located on the island. As soon as they appeared in the skies over the island, they were attacked by the strong anti-aircraft defense. Bush's plane was hit at the moment when he started to dive towards the target. Neglecting the fact that his plane was on fire and the entire cockpit was full of smoke, Bush continued to dive until he realized the bombs had hit and damaged the radio tower. It was only then that he turned his blazing plane towards the USS San Jacinto. Once they were far enough from the island, Bush and two other crew members bailed out of the plane. As he was descending, Bush observed his plane hitting the water and disappear into the waves. Moments after, as he hit the water, his struggle began. With a heavy soaked flight suit, wounded head, and eyes still burning from the smoke in the cockpit, Bush had to fight to stay on top of the water. His fortune was that he landed in the vicinity of a life raft. When he got a hold of it, he inflated it and climbed aboard. The misfortune was that the winds were pushing him closer towards the Japanese-held island, so Bush had to paddle with his arms to stay as far away as possible. At one point, he was spotted by the Japanese, who sent boats to capture him, but these were repelled by American fighter planes. For 4 hours, George was floating in his raft as fighter aircraft were flying above his head to protect him. Finally, he was rescued by the lifeguard submarine, USS Finbeck. Several other airmen were shot down and also escaped by bailing out, but they would not be so lucky. Those 8 aviators who were captured suffered severe torture from the Japanese squad on the island. They were either beaten or stabbed with sharp bamboo sticks, after which they were killed. The most horrifying part was that the bodies of 4 of them were used to prepare a meal for the Japanese officers. By the wish of Major Sueo Matoba, Japanese surgeon Dr. Taraki removed the liver from one of the dead U.S. pilots and handed it over to the cook. He then prepared it with soy sauce and vegetables and served it in small pieces pierced with bamboo sticks. Major Matoba, in the company of other officers and commander of the island, General Yoshio Takibana, feasted on this gruesome meal with sake. They believed it was good medicine for the stomach. The same feast was repeated with the body parts of 3 of the other aviators. At the time, Bush knew nothing about this crime that was kept secret, even though the executors were eventually trialed in 1946. It was not until 2003, and a study published in the book, Flyboys, A True Story of Courage, that George H.W. Bush and the entire public learned of the terrible destiny of the captured airmen. In November 1944, Bush returned to the USS San Jacinto and continued to fight over the Philippines. After a few months, his entire unit returned to the States due to heavy casualties, and in September 1945, George H.W. Bush was honorably discharged from duty. Even though he flew 58 combat missions, had 126 carrier landings, and 1,228 flight hours, the mission over the island of Chichijima was one that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross. As he later claimed, these were the moments that he remembered for the rest of his life. The Watergate scandal between 1972 and late 1973. There was a series of mysterious meetings in an underground car park near Washington, D.C. between Washington Post journalist Robert Bob Woodward and a mysterious anonymous informant name of Deep Throat. He chillingly revealed the shocking revelation that a recent break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters at the nearby Watergate Hotel and office building was not just a simple burglary, but was, in fact, politically motivated. Worse was to come when it was further revealed that the people behind the break-in were backed by none other than the White House administration of the time, led by President Richard Nixon. It seems his motive was to collect information and place telephone bugging devices in the Democratic headquarters that could prove useful to him in his re-election campaign later that year. President Nixon had become both desperate and paranoid towards the end of his first term, as he scrambled to maintain his hold on the presidential office of the United States. Among his many problems was the negotiated withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam, a prolonged and now highly unpopular war. Nixon's campaign ticket of peace proved very popular among the American people, however, who, having returned from the precipice of nuclear war only a decade earlier, were now witnessing a period of nurtured detent. This de-escalation of hostilities between the U.S. and the so-called Red States of the East even saw President Nixon pay a diplomatic visit to China in early 1972 to discuss trade, among other issues. Occupying a strong position heading into the election campaign, then Nixon naturally decided to deny any involvement in what was now being called the Watergate scandal, and the public chose to believe him. As a result, on November 7, 1972, Nixon was re-elected President of the United States in a landslide victory, but still allegations about Watergate would not go away. Before long, it emerged to the public that Nixon, among other high-ranking members of the Republican Party, were said to be funding a covert group to carry out clandestine operations. Their activities included gaining access to people's private mail, the widespread bugging of telephones, and carrying out burglaries in an effort to gather information. It was believed that this information would then be used to take down or coerce political opponents. Despite mounting evidence, Nixon continued to deny any knowledge or involvement of any of these illegal activities, while behind the scenes his administration desperately sought for ways to distance themselves from the situation. Things went from bad to worse when, in a rather embarrassing turn of events, it was also revealed that Nixon owed nearly $500,000 in back taxes. This tarnishing report dealt a further blow to Nixon's public image, as trust in the president began to unravel. Throughout 1973, pressure was also piled on the presidency in the form of the Senate Watergate Committee, a special branch established by the Senate to investigate the Watergate break-in and any other activities of espionage associated with the 1972 election campaign. The committee was empowered to conduct judicial proceedings, with hearings and testimonies of some of Nixon's closest advisors broadcast on national television throughout the summer months. It was during these Watergate hearings that one of the most pivotal moments of the investigation occurred. In a line of questioning, White House Deputy Assistant Alexander Butterfield was reluctantly forced to reveal the existence of the now infamous White House tapes. The tapes belonged to a new recording system that automatically recorded conversations in the Oval Office, among other private locations in the White House. Possessing all the incriminating evidence the committee would need, Nixon did everything in his power to block the release of the tapes and the investigation as a whole in the latter half of 1973. When subpoenaed under the initiative of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, Nixon refused to release the tapes, invoking his presidential right of executive privilege. When Cox refused to back down and continued his push to expose the president, Nixon ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire the troublesome prosecutor. Both Richardson and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus refused to comply, electing to resign in protest instead. While Cox was eventually removed by Solicitor General Robert Bork, his exit alongside that of two of the nation's leading legal figures infamously became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. These developments were naturally met with public outcry as calls for the president's impeachment began. By November 1973, the situation had become so bad for Nixon that during a televised Q&A session at Disney World's contemporary resort, he felt compelled to state, "People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook." Well, I'm not a crook. By early 1974, however, Nixon's defense had all but capitulated. In March, a number of the president's closest aides and advisors were formally charged on different accounts of perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. In a last-ditch effort, the administration agreed to release an edited version of the transcripts made from the White House tapes. While the contents of the transcripts effectively swept away the last remnants of support for Nixon, investigators nevertheless pushed the issue further, seeking the complete release of the audio tapes. In July, Nixon was defeated in a Supreme Court ruling, and the White House tapes were released to the public. The unedited tapes conclusively tied President Nixon to the Watergate break-in and the further operations of espionage that surrounded the 1972 election campaign. Finally, with the Republican Party washing their hands of the situation on August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency rather than be removed from office. Nixon then retired from politics in disgrace, his reputation in ruin. Before criminal charges could be brought against him, however, Nixon was controversially granted a full pardon by the incoming president, Gerald Ford. Nixon was to never hold another political office again. Instead, he devoted the rest of his life to writing and the calling of international affairs. In this period, he undertook many trips abroad to visit various national governments. Famously, in 1977, Nixon conducted a revealing interview with British journalist David Frost, in which the former president attempted to explain his case to the American people. The interview was received with mixed emotions in the United States, where some criticized Nixon for trying to save his reputation, while others saw it as a genuine, heartfelt apology. In the end, Nixon's more positive accomplishments on the world stage were allowed to shine through, and when he died, a respected statesman in 1994, President Bill Clinton, alongside former U.S. presidents George Bush Sr., Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, and Gerald Ford were all in attendance. As for the mysterious informant Deep Throat, it was not until 2005, over 30 years later, that it was finally revealed that it was none other than the former associate director of the FBI, William Mark Felt. He said he had leaked the information at the time, as it was his moral duty to highlight the shady goings-on in the Nixon administration. Assassination of John F. Kennedy, Friday, November 22, 1963. John F. Kennedy served as president during the height of the Cold War. During his presidency, he saw the increase of military spending on both nuclear and conventional forces, and increased the number of U.S. advisors in Vietnam from 400 to 16,000. The Bay of Pigs fiasco, the failure of 1,400 Cuban exiles trained by the CIA to invade their own country, began at the start of his presidency. Then there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, resulting in the USSR and the USA signing the Test Ban Treaty, forbidding nuclear testing in the atmosphere. It also established the hotline, a direct telephone contact between the White House and the Kremlin. During Kennedy's time in office, the Berlin Wall was built by the Soviets in order to stop refugees from fleeing from East Germany to West Germany. In Berlin, he delivered a speech challenging Soviet oppression and gave hope to the people of the city. But in the winter of 1963, the presidency of John F. Kennedy would be tragically cut short. On November 21, 1963, President John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline, departed on Air Force One for a 2-day, 5-city tour of Texas. He was to announce his candidacy for the 1964 presidential elections there, because Texas was vital for his re-election. Texans needed to be convinced, as the state was largely not in favor of Kennedy's civil rights policies and handling of foreign policies like the Bay of Pigs fiasco. The feuding among Democratic Party leaders there also hindered his chances of re-election, and they needed to be brought together. The next morning, on November 22nd, Kennedy made a speech to a large crowd outside the hotel that he had stayed in at Fort Worth, and then made another speech inside, at a breakfast hosted by the local Chamber of Commerce. He would say in the last speech he would ever make, This is a very dangerous and uncertain world. We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it. The presidential party left the Texas hotel and went by motorcade to Carswell Air Force Base, boarding Air Force One, and landing at Dallas's Love Field Airport a short time later. President Kennedy and his wife shook hands with an enthusiastic crowd and sat in the back seats of their limousine as part of the motorcade. Democratic Texas Governor John Connally and his wife were seated in the seats in front of them. In front of these seats were two Secret Service agents. The president's next stop was the Dallas Trademark, approximately 10 miles away, where Kennedy was scheduled to deliver another speech. It's estimated that about 200,000 people lined the route to the Trademark. The limousine the president was traveling in was an open-top 1961 Lincoln 1961 Lincoln Continental four-door convertible limousine that was called the SS 100X. The motorcade moved through Dealey Plaza in downtown Dallas. Nellie Connally, the First Lady of Texas, turned around to the president, who was sitting behind her, and commented, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you," which President Kennedy acknowledged by saying, "No, you certainly can't." Those were the last words ever spoken by John F. Kennedy. At 12:30 p.m., the motorcade was passing the grassy knoll to the north of Elm Street and moving towards the Texas School Book Depository. Then gunshots were heard. A bullet hit President Kennedy's neck and hit Governor Connally's shoulder and wrist. A second shot then hit President Kennedy in the head, covering the limousine's rear interior with fragments of skull, blood, and brain. The impact was so severe that blood and fragments even landed on the Secret Service car that was following behind. The limousine sped off to Parkland Memorial Hospital within minutes. But it was already too late, and doctors' efforts were in vain. Kennedy was declared dead at 1 p.m. Connally would recover from his wounds. The country and the world was in shock. President Kennedy's body was taken from Parkland Hospital to Love Field and loaded onto Air Force One. At 2:38 p.m., sheltered on board Air Force One in case of further assassination attempts, Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office with Jacqueline Kennedy by his side, still wearing her blood-spattered clothes. The oath was administered by U.S. District Court Judge Sarah Hughes. Less than an hour earlier, a person had been arrested by the police. Witnesses had reported hearing and seeing shots from different directions, but several accounts mentioned the southeast corner window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. Only 2 employees from the building were missing, one who had walked outside and wasn't allowed back into the building by police at the time of the shooting, and another, Lee Harvey Oswald, who had only been working there for a month. He had been seen and described by the witnesses who saw him in the 6th floor window, so a description was sent out by the police. As he moved down the floors, he was encountered by Dallas police officer Marion L. Baker, who had his gun drawn. He was allowed to pass, however, because Oswald's supervisor identified him as an employee. Oswald had slipped out of the book depository after the shooting and walked several blocks, caught a city bus, and then hailed a taxi that took him straight to his boarding house. There, he picked up a pistol and a coat and began to walk aimlessly. Oswald had already left the scene on a bus to his boarding house by 12:04 p.m., but the police did discover a rifle underneath some boxes and its shells by the window on the 6th floor, as witnesses had described. The police identified it as a 7.65 Mauser, but later the FBI announced that the police were mistaken and the rifle was an Italian Carcano Minidi 138 bolt-action rifle. The second-hand Italian-made Carcano rifle had been purchased by Oswald earlier in the year under the alias A. Heidel. The Carcano was a notoriously inaccurate weapon, and for many it's hard to believe that with such a weapon Oswald, despite his former military training, could hit a moving target like the president twice with such precision at a range of around approximately 250 feet. Shortly afterwards, a Dallas policeman by the name of J.D. Tippit was patrolling his usual area and saw a man who fitted the Oswald description on the corner of 10th Street and Patton Avenue. After a brief exchange of words, Oswald shot Tippit 4 times with a .38 revolver, killing him in front of witnesses. Oswald ran to the nearby commercial street of Jefferson Boulevard. A man named Johnny Calvin Brewer noticed his suspicious behavior and followed Oswald for several blocks to the Texas Theater. Oswald ducked there without buying a ticket. Brewer hailed the police officer, Nick McDonald, who entered the theater accompanied by another officer. Both officers apprehended Oswald on the stage of the Texas Theater, 6 blocks away from the scene of the crime at 1:05 p.m. When Oswald was arrested, he was carrying a forged identity card bearing the name Alec J. Heidel, the alias he used to buy the rifle. However, Texas law imposed no control over the purchase of weapons. There was no reason to buy it under an assumed name. So why did Oswald buy the rifle and the handgun by mail order under his assumed name? Curiously, Army intelligence was known to have a file on A.J. Heidel, the contents of which were destroyed before it could be acquired by investigators. On Sunday morning, November 24th, after being held for 2 nights, Oswald was being transferred from city jail to the county jail. The event was being broadcast live on TV for millions of Americans to see. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a man shot a pistol point blank at Oswald, who died 2 hours later at Parkland Memorial Hospital. The man who fired the pistol was Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner. He said that he killed Oswald to spare Mrs. Kennedy the discomfiture of coming back to trial. The state funeral for President Kennedy was held on November 25, 1963, with representatives from more than 100 countries and millions of viewers watching it on television. On November 29, 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson created the President's Commission on the Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, also known as the Warren Commission, after its chairman, Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the United States. Its 888-page final report was presented to Johnson on September 24, 1964. The Warren Report concluded that Oswald, who had become a skilled marksman as a Marine, had fired 3 shots, one that entered Kennedy's neck and exited through his throat before hitting Connally, one that hit Kennedy in the back of the head, fatal shot, and one that missed the president, but ricocheted off a piece of sidewalk, which injured James Tagg. Many disagreed with these findings and argued instead that there had been a second shooter on the grassy knoll in Dealey Plaza, that the motorcade had been approaching, and there were witnesses who thought they had heard shots coming from the direction of a railroad beyond the knoll. The report, however, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby had acted alone, although the findings of the Warren Commission continued to be controversial. Air Force One, 1953 to present. The term Air Force One is actually the call sign for any aircraft that is carrying the President of the United States. When the President is traveling by U.S. Marine helicopter, his call sign is Marine One, and on the rare occasion that the President is on a commercial flight, his aircraft call sign is always referred to as Executive One. Air Force Two is the call sign given to any plane that is carrying the Vice President. For security reasons, the President and Vice President never fly in the same aircraft. The first aircraft converted to be a dedicated presidential aircraft was a propeller-driven C-54 Skymaster in 1945. It was nicknamed the Sacred Cow. It had an added sleeping area, extra communication facilities, and a retractable elevator for President Roosevelt and his wheelchair. The need for the President to have his own unique call sign arose from an incident in 1953 when President Eisenhower's aircraft and an Eastern Airlines commercial flight came dangerously close to one another as they both had similar call signs. Since the late 1950s, the president has had a fleet of specially modified aircraft at his disposal, often referred to as the presidential fleet. Over the years, the fleet has used the giant propeller-driven Lockheed Constellation, then Boeing's first jetliner, the 777, and since 1990, the popular Boeing 747. Their role initially was to provide the president with a more secure and flexible form of air transport. But as time passed, their role has evolved to also include a flying crisis center, as well as a nuclear warfare command and control headquarters. The iconic blue and white livery that has adorned the president's aircraft since the early 1960s was brought about by President Kennedy, who felt that the old black and red-nosed one was far too regal-looking. So he hired the American designer Raymond Loewy to design something he felt was modern, using the lettering style of the American Declaration of Independence to spell out the words United States of America along the length of the main body. He also added the presidential seal near the nose and a large American flag on the tail. The current aircraft are a pair of heavily modified Boeing 747s via air-to-air refueling. They can stay airborne for a very long time. There is a president's suite and office, a conference room and dining room, senior staff meeting room, medical room, and quarters for staff, guests, press, security, and Secret Service. It has state-of-the-art security, including electronic countermeasures that jam enemy radar and flares that release from the wings to confuse heat-seeking missiles. The length of its wiring reaches 240 miles long and is heavily shielded to protect the aircraft from a nuclear electromagnetic pulse if such an attack took place. The armor-plated body can withstand a nuclear blast from the ground, and it also has armored windows. Other features are classified, but though these aircraft have been continually updated over the years, they are now getting expensive to run and are due to be replaced in the next few years with a new Boeing 747 variant, the VC-25B aircraft, at a fixed-price contract worth $3.90 billion.